New Midland Group is a consortium of 3 artist-led organisations located in Nottingham. Backlit, One Forestry Street and Primary support the development of artists in the city and the wider region, providing space for the production and display of art. The New Midland Group development programme is taking place over 18 months and is intended to support established artists, individuals with an interest in working in contemporary art, and anyone who falls anywhere in between. There is an emphasis on creators who have not engaged in formal arts education or are from backgrounds currently underrepresented within the sector. Through this programme, NMG focuses on providing routes into contemporary art and better understanding and articulating the value of artist development. The programme centres around a group of core associates, many of whom are here this evening, who are offered a slate of activity, including mentoring, collaboration and professional development opportunities, with a focus on interdisciplinary research, redefining collaborative practice, building confidence, as well as thinking about sustainability, both artistic and environmental. The project also includes an expansive public programme of free discussions, workshops and events, such as the talk this evening, taking place primarily online and some across partner venues. The programme also includes bursary opportunities for artists within the Midlands, which includes a number of public outcomes and events. The programme is funded by Arts Council England, supported by a growing number of partners from across the region and beyond. Tonight's speaker is Susan Schuppli. Susan investigates the politics of cold, exploring the ways in which knowledge, practices from ice core science and glaciology to integrational wisdom and local observations, climate activism to environmental policy and law engage with the situated material conditions of ice. She draws on her experience as a part of the research agency Forensic Architecture in her consideration of various modes of communication, from legal analysis and public advocacy to theoretical reflection and creative exploration. Susan's artist talk this evening focuses on a body of research and work developed through the Learning from Ice project, which includes a documentary film shot in the Canadian Ice Core Archive and the US Geochemistry Lab in 2019, followed by research into the changing conditions of sea ice and the glacial retreat in the Svalbard Arctic Archipelago. Sorry for my pronunciation there. In October of this year, Susan conducted fieldwork and related activities in the Zanskar region of the Himalayas with glaciologist Dr. Farooq Azam and Faiza. This new work, which she will highlight, combines scientific and artistic approaches to climate change by developing acoustic and aural methodologies in cryospheric research. Through the development of various situated listening practices, the project brought scientific research, local experiences, and intergenerational knowledge of glaciers together. Following a presentation by Susan this evening, we'll open the floor for questions and discussion. And now I'll hand over to Susan. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Colette. And you've sketched out the sort of narrative arc of this evening. So yeah, good evening to everybody. Thank you for joining us online. I have a very big and elderly dog sitting here, and she does bark from time to time, and then I just throw her treats. So the plan for this evening, as Colette was saying, was to really focus us on a recent body of work, which is always a good idea as a practicing artist to begin, in the moment in which you're actually kind of working, rather than sort of the march of history as one goes back into one's sort of like kind of earlier practice. So it's a nice opportunity to bring this cluster of projects together and to provide some insight into how decisions are being made and how specific projects are grappling with sort of key issues. And then I'm learning from that situation and moving to another context. So as Colette was saying, I was recently in the Zanskar region of Ladakh, which is in northern India, and working with mountain villagers in particular and local NGO from Ladakh called Local Futures, along with scientists. And so I'm going to sort of end with that project and a number of clips from that, because you'll see that there's sorry, my dog is barking a bit too much. What I wanted to say was that it's a useful project to, I think, to introduce it to tonight's audience because we see the ways in which a very kind of technical realm of research, which is glaciology, how does that interface with local knowledge traditions or local cultural practices? How does that interface with intergenerational knowledge of climate change, especially for communities living in some of the most kind of climatically precarious parts of our kind of planet? Their lived experience of daily life generates a form of what we might call environmental knowledge. But that's not to say that they would necessarily characterize their understanding of the kind of cyclical nature of the environment in exactly those sort of terms. So part of the project is about how do we actually think about the world of science as creating opportunities of hospitality to bring others into that who may be sort of who are non-experts like myself, and I include myself there. So rather than thinking always about science as that which tells us about the material kind of world with a high degree of kind of technical precision, etc., how does it also open up opportunities for the possibility of sharing knowledge between constituents? I'm going to mute myself and just tell my dog to be quiet. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is just share my screen, and as a practitioner, I'm going to really hope that my work will tell the story of my research. So let me do that now. And I decided to call the presentation Cold Matters. So both in terms of things that the material condition of cold, but that the thermostatic, that is to say the temperature, the condition of temperature is also very, very critical when we're talking about cryospheric environments. This is actually just a clip that I shot when I was in the Svalbard Arctic Archipelago, which is an area shared by Norway and Russia. And I had the good fortune to spend some time there last year, actually, despite the COVID pandemic. This is something that's quite interesting to me, and it's the sort of only time I'm really going to bring in something that looks largely like a kind of legal document. And it's simply to alert yourself to the fact that the frozen parts of our planet, there are vast areas of the planet, I'm saying something extremely obvious, that are covered with water that is frozen. But it's really, really surprising when you actually start to look at the conventions, the United Nations conventions on the laws of the sea, which are a huge body of articles, as they're called, that govern all facets of the ways in which states interact and use water, oftentimes focusing on things like maritime navigation, et cetera, et cetera. There's an article, and we have it right here, Article 234, out of the hundreds and hundreds of pages of this UN convention, there is only one paragraph. This is the entire paragraph that actually recognizes the fact that water has a frozen state and that there are many, many communities whose life worlds are entirely reliant upon that specific condition, especially within the circumpolar north, but also as I came to learn in the communities of northern India, for example, that are living within the Himalayan mountain ranges. So cryospheric environments, though we largely find them in the poles, both Antarctica and in the Arctic, of course, they're mountains and communities, in South America, throughout Europe, Asia, etc. And so it's really important to come to terms with the fact that these areas of the world are often quite overlooked when we talk about climate change and global warming. Our attention, more often than not, will actually be directed to parts of the world that are experiencing like extreme drought, fires, etc. We sometimes don't really consider kind of northern contexts in those kind of more broad-ranging kind of popular discussions, despite the fact that the impact of global warming on the Arctic regions is like 4 times higher than in the rest of the kind of world. So to introduce this project just a little bit, learning from ice has taken me into many different kind of contexts as a researcher, as an artist, as a writer. And I think what's been really productive in working on this project is working with a material. It's incredibly beautiful. As you can see, I'm holding different chunks of ice in these different contexts in which I've been working. But it's a material that's very familiar to us. It's an ordinary material, a domestic material, in as much as it's a very kind of extraordinary material. And of course, ice is the frozen state of water. It also has a gaseous state. But I think it's been really productive to develop an artistic project, engaged with ecological issues and also material evidence of climate change, but working with something that is extremely familiar to almost everybody, and that is ice. And yet ice, such as this chunk of ice that I'm holding in my hand here, which is 20,000 years old, it's a good example because you can really see tiny bubbles of air in that ice sample, and that makes this kind of material the most powerful in terms of telling us the story of greenhouse gas emissions, because trapped in that ice is air from 20,000 years ago. It's very different than a tree ring. So I'm sure you're aware of the fact that we can analyze tree rings and we can have some understanding of precipitation, etc. We can have some understanding of climatic systems through the analysis of a tree ring prior to the invention of tools of measurement, such as the thermometer, etc. But a tree ring is considered it's considered a data proxy, and that means that it's a proxy. It's an indirect form of measurement. Scientists also use coral reefs in the same way. They use lake bed sediments. So the Earth itself is a vast archive, and it contains all kinds of information about the conditions and histories of our planet and its early kind of climactic histories. Ice is a different kind of material form of evidence, because in the ice sheets, what we have is the actual air from hundreds of thousands of years ago, and in fact millions of years ago. So this is actually a very new sample of ice here in my hand. Here's another one, which is 2 million years old, that little sample of ice that is in that bag. So having access to this material archive that can take us back in time 1 million years and give us access to the actual air from a long time ago has allowed scientists to build the global climate model and to really demonstrate the fact that greenhouse gas emissions have accelerated dramatically. And if you're interested in why this is the case, I can talk a little bit more in the Q&A. But suffice to say, the fact that it snows in the poles, in the North Pole and the South Pole, so we have 2 annual layers of snowfall. And that snow basically compresses air, and over thousands and millions of years, the compression of annual layers of snow actually traps the air, and that air is kept in a sort of pristine, natural archival state. And then when you take samples, such as this ice sample here, you can actually release that air. You can melt the ice, you can grind it. There's many different methods that are used. And then you can measure the CO2 and methane that is captured in that sample. So the project begins really with my interest in both using a very familiar material and using that material to follow that material into many, many different contexts. And I began in particular with ice cores. And ice cores are this is an ice core that we're looking at here. And ice cores are, they're columns of ice that are extracted from the glacial ice sheets, primarily Greenland, Antarctica, and also the Arctic regions. This is a great image because we can see very clearly that layer of volcanic ash. So ice cores are considered to provide the highest resolution data set of climatic change, because we can get biannual data. So 2 data sets per year, when you're talking about millions of years, is considered extremely high resolution. And anything that goes into the atmosphere will be stored in the world's glacial ice sheets. It doesn't matter where it happened, because over time everything gets recirculated around the planet. So there could be a volcanic eruption in Iceland that will still make its way into the ice sheets of Antarctica. And ice cores are, once they're extracted from the ground, they come out in meter-long sections. So one ice core takes about 5 years to drill, because you're taking out small columns of ice, a meter long, and it takes it's an extremely laborious process when you're taking something that's only a meter long, but you're building an ice core that's many kilometers long. And it's interesting to see the scientists, they always draw on these ice cores, and these arrows are crucial. Uli, that's no. These arrows on the ice core are crucial because the most important thing is you can never turn an ice core upside down, because you'd completely invert the historic record that it contains. So when you pull something out of the ground, the number one rule is you have to know what the top and bottom is as you're assembling the core, because otherwise you could really produce a very flawed data set. So this is what we're seeing here. And I'm going to take you into the Canadian Ice Core Archive in short order. Actually, Colette, I need to double check that I've actually clicked on share audio. So I'm going to go out of screen share, unfortunately, and go back in, because I think I didn't do that.
Sure, no problem.
Let me just quickly do that. There we go. Oh yeah, I've got share sound. I just wanted to double check, because once we get going, it doesn't make sense to do it after the fact.
Thank you. And if anyone has any issues with the audio, just drop me a message in the chat and we'll see what we can do. But hopefully it will be nice and clear.
Yeah, and there's a couple of things in the chat. Is there anything I need to know about?
No, just me sharing information for people who joined after 6 p.m. So nothing that you need to worry about, Susan.
Okay, great. So now enough of that preamble. So give you a little bit of sense of like what an ice core is. So I'm going to run through some clips from various projects that I've produced, and they're just short clips that I've extracted. So hopefully you can get a sense of what's at stake in some of these projects, also the kind of visual language I'm developing, but really importantly for me is the acoustic language that I've tried to develop in these projects. I really have worked very sort of extensively with sound, and really used sound to help me tell the stories that I need to tell. And in particular, when it comes to this project, using sound and creating the sort of sound design for these documentaries to alert us to the kind of internal life worlds of ice, and to make the kind of, I'm trying to use sound to both trouble the image, because sometimes to denaturalize some of my imagery, but also to alert us to the fact that something is happening. And so sound, sound can give us these kind of like triggers that are also can operate in many different ways, including sort of psychologically. So let me play a little bit of this clip, which is actually towards the end of the documentary. I'll just pause there. So this is Allison. She's an ice core scientist working in the Canadian Arctic, and this is a very manual set of operations happening here. So this isn't like the big ice coring infrastructures that you would find in Antarctica, which have hundreds and hundreds of people and a lot of kind of machinery. This is very high up in the Arctic, and is only accessible for people who are basically qualified kind of mountaineers. So it's a much more kind of manual, almost DIY form of ice coring, and they're taking a relatively shallow core. They're taking out relatively shallow core samples. We can see them sort of lined up there on the ground, and then those are going to be shipped south to the ice core archive in these insulated boxes that you have here. And now the next clip actually takes us into the actual ice core archive, where these samples will be stored and can be used, and their lifespan is about 100 years. So these ice core samples, scientists work on them. Anybody who has an interest can order them. They're always made available free of charge. You have to have a very you have to have a very convincing explanation as to why you might want to order a specific chunk of ice from a particular kind of core and geography. But nonetheless, it's part of this kind of collective global kind of enterprise. And there's just a handful of these ice core archives, which are in effect just large freezer facilities where they store these ice samples. So Canada has the largest collection of Arctic ice, and that is where that is the archive that I shot in as a filmmaker. So let me play the opening from that project.
In 2011, the Geological Survey of Canada's ice core collection faced an uncertain future. Comprised of more than 1,000 meters of ice, drilled from glaciers in the Canadian High Arctic over a period of 4 decades, the cores and the scientists who worked on them were met with shifting research priorities and budget cuts. The prospect of thousands of years of climate history literally melting away, spurred glaciologist Martin Sharp into developing a plan to save and rehouse the collection. The Canadian Ice Core Archive, now at the University of Alberta, shelters this unique collection of historic ice. Cores from Mount Logan in the Yukon, as well as from the Arctic Archipelago, including the Penny Ice Cap on Baffin Island, the Prince of Wales Ice Field and Agassiz Ice Cap both on Ellesmere Island, and the Devon Ice Cap on Devon Island, are all preserved within these cylindrical tubes.
So yes, you can, I'm sure, hear with that project that I'm trying to develop a certain kind of acoustic language that can alert us to the fact that that ice cores aren't simply these mute and silent witnesses to planetary change, but they're actually lively in the sense of certainly microorganisms and what are called extremophiles can still sort of exist in ice, but they're also lively from the point of view of they're very kind of informationally rich. And so in that little clip, I was really trying to work with the sound design to kind of animate this archive, which is really the space of preservation. The documentary, as it unfolds, will eventually take us into take us to the Athabasca Glacier. It will take us into a chemistry lab in the United States, and really has many different sort of registers. There's also a chapter in the documentary that starts to explore the production of artificial cold. So the whole kind of energy infrastructure that is required to keeping these ice core samples frozen. But for the purposes of being able to get to the sort of listening from ice project, I just want to show a few short clips from various works. Now, that project dealing with ice cores is heavily narrated. Even if I'm trying to work with sound, I'm telling a story, and it's quite a sort of complicated story. So I found myself having to develop a voiceover narration for the project. When I went to Svalbard and shot there, it was an opportunity that came about quite suddenly through a glaciologist, Miriam Jackson, who asked me if I wanted to join on a circumnavigation on a sailboat for a couple of weeks around one of the biggest island basically in the Svalbard Arctic Archipelago. And that takes us to about 1,000 kilometers from the North Pole. So in agreeing to sort of like jump on the sailboat and to work as kind of crew, in between doing all that, I was trying to shoot material and do audio field recordings. Consequently, I didn't have a specific story I was setting out to tell. So in the end, the film called Arctic Archipelago, I made the decision to commission a musician friend of mine to produce an original score. So there is no narration whatsoever. There's actually a piece of music that is written. And one of the visual strategies I tried to work with was this image here. The strategy is that of chromatic aberration, to really break apart the light spectrum. And so I was, in this particular kind of work, I was trying to sort of signal the transformations that are happening due to things like climate change, through the kind of breakup of the chromatic spectrum of ice, and to kind of give this sort of spectral dimension to the ice, almost in a it isn't a science fiction sort of film, but it's gesturing towards these sort of sci-fi kind of inheritances that it came to me in particular out of literature. In fact, literature that deals with Arctic environments often has will often sort of position like icy worlds as sometimes as sinister places, as things where something is happening and life is sort of out of like whack in these environments. Anyway, so it was an attempt to say to challenge myself as an artist to say I'm not going to use any voiceover narration. I'm just going to use music. So I'll play a clip that is much closer to the end of the piece, just to give you a sense of the kind of audiovisual vocabulary that I was trying to kind of generate. And it's a clip with the glaciologist Miriam at the front of the sailboat. Come on. Why is it not playing? That was a bit of an abrupt ending. Um, so I just wanted to play that little clip, which is at the very end of the film. So the most of the film isn't looking at these sort of really kind of gargantuan, kind of monstrous icebergs as they float by, but to give you a sense of the kind of musicality that I was developing in that piece, which will be really important for this next kind of project called Listening to Ice, which hasn't as of yet been transformed into an actual film as of yet. It just exists as materials that I gathered and have assembled some of them on my website. But with the piece that we just looked at, that little clip, I was, of course, what I was also doing was doing audio recordings and mixing the sort of natural ambient sounds of the environment with these, basically with the synthesized score that my friend Mohammed Safa designed for the piece. So it's a combination of actual field recordings and then the kind of creation of a new score. But it was an interesting challenge for me to think about how I could develop a piece and really remove myself as a narrator, in part because the environment itself, that far north, does have this certain kind of like mythical kind of dimensions. Or mythical kind of aspects. There's no way, you can't really avoid that. At the same time, I was also like a little bit trapped in that last piece because I'm very aware of the sort of multiple kind of histories that are part of that sort of region and context, but also the kind of politics that are part of that space, including, the kinds of resources that would be required to bring someone like myself into an environment like that, where I could even sort of spend time and shoot those materials. So the whole kind of like expeditionary imaginary that's still very kind of operative often in these kinds of remote environments. So I made a very small companion piece that I call a footnote, and it's in the small companion piece that is always exhibited with the large sort of projection of the piece with the music. The companion piece is where where I'm actually speaking really kind of like actively, and that piece is called Not Planet Earth, or how Not Planet Earth, or How to Denaturalize the Image. It's got this really long title. And it's this moment of critical reflection where I talk about all of the kind of politics of the image, the politics of colonial histories that are part of these sort of northern geographies, etc. And I made the decision as an artist to separate those two works. I could have brought all of that sort of research and critical reflection into the actual film, but I thought it wasn't actually my perceptual and visual experience when I was there. I didn't see the military intelligence infrastructures that are operating in the Arctic. I didn't see the nuclear fleet, whether it's the Trident subs from the UK or the Russian nuclear submarines under the Arctic sea ice. We don't see that. We don't see the large telecommunications infrastructures that have been built in the north from military intelligence gathering to like mobile phone kind of communication. We don't see that. That's part of the electromagnetic spectrum. So a lot of the politics that are happening there, and even global warming, it's happening at an accelerated pace. But unless you really are extremely familiar with the changes that you are kind of encountering, a lot of these events aren't organized within the visual register, and we don't really see them. We might be aware of them. And so I thought, well, I'm not just going to then layer a whole bunch of information into that film and make us, tell this other sort of story And in some way, I wanted to maintain that visual field as a kind of absence in which the politics is a kind of specter, but it's not explicitly in the piece unless you start to ask certain questions about what might be going on and how the project was made and who has access to those kinds of spaces and what are the kind of what are the documentary traditions that have looked at those kind of northern geographies, et cetera, et cetera. So all of that kind of reflection I put into the small footnote piece that gets exhibited beside it on a sort of smallish screen or monitor on the floor. But with my remaining time, I wanted to now focus on two bodies of work that I'm literally working on right now. And listening to ice is a project that involved myself, but also a team of colleagues in India working together, working with communities, working with scientists, working with students, all around this one particular glacier at Drangdrung in the Zanskar region of Ladakh, as I mentioned. And so this is just a shot of from one of our workshops where a group of local villagers came for this deep listening to ice workshop. And we were actually using hydrophones, but when we first arrived, and none of them had actually been on a glacier before, even though their village and the water source for their village is completely reliant on this glacier. But we were just listening directly with the human ear to the sort of to the underwater glacial lake that is moving through this particular kind of glacier. And then this is just to give you a sense of the environment. So we're camping at 5,000 meters, and this was shot in October. So in fact, just like last month. So it was our last opportunity before the winter season really set in to do some of this work, because we had been postponed in our field work because of COVID travel restrictions to India, but also sort of domestically within the country itself. This is Farooq. He's my scientific colleague, and I'm just going to play a clip where he will tell us a little bit about this particular glacier.
So the glaciers like this in Ladakh region, in general everywhere in the Himalayan world actually, they are the storage of water, fresh water, and they become very important if we talk about some dry areas like Ladakh and Zanskar, because we don't have enough rain here. This is rain shadow area, and the main source of water is these glaciers and snow during winters. So basically the local people here in these villages, they are using this water for their municipal purposes as well as agriculture. And because they are changing drastically now, so the availability of water is changing, seasonality is changing. So these people in local villages, they are the severely affected people because of these climate change impacts on glacier and then the changes in river runoff.
And this is a former MA. She did her MA with me at Goldsmiths, and I've been working with Faiza for several years now. And so, a short clip from Faiza.
Normally, we privilege sight over sound, but to reverse that and to focus on the hearing. And I wasn't actually really looking at the ice so much as I was trying to listen to it. And
this is just a short clip. One of the things that we did was we installed an acoustic sensor in the bottom of the glacial lake, and so we in order to do that, we obviously had to bring and carry the canoe through this kind of rocky terrain and eventually make our way onto the lake.
So
So, Farooq, I think we need to paddle closer to the snout of the glacier and just really get a sense of where it's going to be most kind of dynamic. You were saying that at this time of year there's probably less calving events, but I still think it's worth trying to see whether we can somehow capture some of those acoustic phenomena, even if it's maybe just the crackling of underwater ice or something like that. I don't know. What do you think?
So we were there at the hump actually, having some big boulders. Yeah. It was good experience to go by kayak there. Anyway, means the idea is to take that route and then cross the glacier and then reach this site.
So I'm just playing different clips from our 3 weeks there, working there. This is, I think, a couple clips from the workshops that we ran with the local community. And what was really important about this, I haven't shown you any of the sort of technical sensors yet, and I won't because I haven't edited any of that material. But with the workshop, we tried to create experiences where people could have some sense of what was at stake in the science. So we're using these hydrophones, which are microphones that can sit in water and do real-time recording. And the instrument that I brought with me from the UK is one that can record for 6 months continuously. So it records acoustic data for 6 months, and after 6 months you have to change the batteries and download the data, and then you can analyze that data. But when the sensor's sitting in the lake at the snout of the glacier, you're not listening to the sensor. There's no means to plug anything into it to actively listen to what it is collecting as data. You do that always after the fact. Whereas with the workshops that we ran with the villagers on the glacier was using different similar but different hydrophones, and actually listening to what was going on inside these glaciers. So I'll play a couple more clips of that. Sorry, let me just go back. I wonder if there's to the end. Oh yeah, I thought I had one more clip. So I recorded while the women were listening to the ice. I also recorded what they are hearing. So, of course, when you're standing there, you're not actually hearing the ice unless you actually have the headphones on. But for the purposes of this clip, I've layered on the ice that the women are hearing. So let me just play a little bit more. So this is Jigme. He's from the local NGO that we worked with and was helping to translate. Everybody is speaking Ladakhi.
It's like hovering helicopter. Mera. No, mera. Uzu awa chut hotu paya.
Yeah, and what she was saying there was that the ice sounds like the whirring of a helicopter, and other women were saying, "Oh, it sounds like the sound of boiling tea." So it was really nice. They were describing the sounds that they were hearing of the glacier, but connecting it to their daily lived experiences, and it was a really kind of nice sort of moment to make these kind of bridges between this sort of techno-scientific world and the kind of domestic lives, and bring those two realms together through like acts of hearing and listening. This has no sound, so I'll just play it and speak over it. No, Uli. But Farooq mentioned water shortage. So this is footage that we shot at Kulum, another mountain village, and it's a place where they've actually started to build artificial glaciers, because if you look at the aridity and dryness here, this is one of the first villages in the Himalayas to experience climate refugees. So the villagers, and you can see a small village down at the bottom of the at the bottom of the mountain. That village is now abandoned, and the people that lived here and worked here had to move because of complete lack of water shortage. The glaciers that used to be there are gone, and thus their source of water is gone. And one of the kind of so water scarcity is a really huge issue in the Himalayas, because all of these communities, the only source of water, of course, is glacial melt. And if glaciers are receding and melting and it's getting warmer, it means that winters are shorter, the spring comes earlier, etc., etc. So it also means that even when there is glacial runoff and water coming into the villages from the mountains, it's coming at the wrong times. It's coming too early for purposes of planting, etc. So this village of Kulum is one of 49 villages now out of 400 this one has experienced like extreme drought to the point where the village was abandoned, and there's another 49 to 50 that are undergoing kind of similar kind of conditions. So to really give you a sense of the kind of urgency of the situation. And so there are techniques that are being developed in terms of trying to build artificial glaciers and basically produce these sort of like reservoirs, excuse me, of ice that will then slowly kind of like thaw over the course of the spring and early summer. What time is it? Excuse me. So what I wanted to just quickly finish on, so that we have, it's 7 o'clock actually. I'll go for another about 5, maybe 10 minutes max, so that we have 20 minutes for discussion. So just to say that with the materials from the Himalayas, and they also include many other things, encounters with environmentalists, with elderly people who have intergenerational knowledge of climate change. That so, for example, we met a song collector, an elderly man who has memorized 1,300 folk songs from the 1960s from the region of Ladakh in Tibet. Many of those songs contain information about the mountains, about snow, ice, about seasons, about times of growth, the cyclical kind of patterns of agrarian life. So the project has a lot of different kind of elements, and it's quite It's really exciting for me to be working with a much bigger group of people and working in a far less solitary way than I sometimes work with a very small team of two, myself and another person I've worked with for a long time, Henry. But this time we were 21 people doing various things. And so that was very different experience for me, but also really, really enjoyable. So part of this work also has a series of cold cases that I've developed with the NGO Forensic Architecture that I've been working with for many years and was one of the coordinators of when we first started out, but just over 10 years ago now. And these cold cases take me back to the ice core project, because when I was working on that ice core documentary and really looking at the major infrastructure that I mentioned that is required, the freezer systems, which is very energy intensive to keep these global ice core archives going 24/7, I really started to think about cold and specifically the production of artificial cold. Thinking about cold not just as a natural condition, but cold as something that actually is produced through, obviously, through freezers, through air conditioning, etc., etc. I'm stating something we already know, but sometimes we don't think about something that temperature as something that actually is highly subject to modulation. And in particular, the three cases that I'll just play a short clip from, temperature can be weaponized, and temperature can result in human rights violations. So these three cold cases all look at the weaponization of temperature in very different ways. And I'll just play a few short, I'll play a little bit from each of the three videos. And you can also find these videos on my website. And in this case, because they're works that were commissioned for Toronto and Montreal, they're really based within the North American context. And I'm originally from Canada, so this is also taking me back to the situations and histories that I'm more familiar with in some ways. Let me see. So this is a clip from the cold case called Icebox Detention, which is looking at the immigration policies along the US-Mexico border, and in particular what is called icebox detention, which is the holding cells where migrants are put are often kept unusually cold as a strategy of border deterrence and punishment as well. If they're talking too loud or they're too noisy, etc., etc. It's been well documented by human rights agencies, and the guards will often threaten migrants, will threaten them by threatening them with turning down the temperature, etc. So here we have temperature used as part of the kind of toolbox of border policing. So let me just play a little bit of a clip from this. We're going to jump into the middle of it.
Testimonies from former icebox detainees and even guards corroborate accounts of the dire conditions experienced in these cells, all emphasizing how frigid it gets with air conditioning blasting throughout the facilities. Detainees describe being forced to sit and sleep, sometimes for multiple nights, on cold, concrete floors and benches, receiving little or no food or clean drinking water, being packed into overcrowded and unsanitary holding cells without basic hygiene items, denied adequate medical screening or care, denied communication with family members, legal counsel or consulates, and coerced into signing deportation papers. In the differential experiences of temperature, cold becomes a register of the violence of such bordering practices. despite numerous investigative reports exposing these inhumane conditions, and even allegations that CBP is violating both its own policies and that of the U.S. Constitution, icebox detention continues unabated. According to law, temperatures in the temporary CBP holding cells must be maintained at between 60.
The piece ends with a lot of testimony by women talking about their experiences of cold. Something you read is on text. So this is a much more straightforward sort of investigative piece, if you will. And I also worked with forensic architecture on the project. So we did, let me see if so we also modeled one of the cells here based on security.
Which the experience of temperature is conditioned by a complex set of dynamic interactions between entities over time. We modeled the architecture, materials, bodies, and air of a typical holding cell based on visual evidence revealed during a legal proceeding. Modulation of temperature becomes yet another mode of governance over migrant lives, an instrument of abusive control aimed at dissuading migrants from claiming formal asylum, which would see them moved from their temporary holding cells into permanent immigration and customs enforcement facilities.
So this cold case here, this is called weaponizing water against water protectors at Standing Rock in 2016 during the No DAPL movement, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. So let me play a clip from here.
On November 18th, the Morton County Sheriff of North Dakota released a cold weather warning. It was specifically directed towards water protectors and other protesters involved in the No DAPL movement.
I don't know about you, but I will die for my people in my land and my younger generation. Look at all you cowards over there. Just me. Just me.
You know what really makes me sad? The fact I probably fought beside of you and OIF and OEF. Disgusted.
Before you shot my wife, you're going to have to answer to someone higher than that, than me, than you. Praying for you.
Please stop shooting us.
Keep shooting. I don't give a fuck. Don't be mad when we shoot back.
There's people getting just soaked. Sort of hard to see, but this is just fucking chaos.
2 days later, despite sub-zero temperatures and a wind chill of 14 degrees Fahrenheit or minus 10 Celsius, the Morton County Sheriff began a 12-hour assault against water protectors at Backwater Bridge. The assault involved the use of tear gas, concussion grenades, less lethal shotgun rounds, and in particular, the use of water, drenching protesters throughout the night. As core temperatures of bodies.
So let me see. And then we also did so there were 300 cases of hypothermia as a consequence of this tactic. Let's jump ahead a little, yeah.
Using photogrammetry software, we were able to calibrate the drone footage obtained by Unicorn Riot. This allowed us to build a precise model of the area around the blockade and locate people, vehicles, and objects within the site. An LRAD sound cannon had also been fired throughout the day in efforts to push back water protectors attempting to clear the blockade. Stationed on the north side of the bridge of Highway 1806, we can see a row of armed riot police standing behind 2-meter-tall razor wire. Positioned among them are 4 military tactical vehicles, 1 armored police car, a Lenco Bearcat, and 1 mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicle, or MRAP. Further back, we can see 2 fire department trucks, which likely delivered the water hose to the police, as well as mobile floodlights used to illuminate the scene.
You shot a pregnant woman. My wife.
The position of the MRAP and floodlights allowed us to photo match and situate numerous videos captured from the ground and air. This enabled us to map the indiscriminate use of what is referred to as less lethal weaponry on the night of the 20th of November 2016. We mapped a total of 78 cameras, detailing 68 instances of the use of the water hose, 7 tear gas clouds, in addition to another 7 sightings of projectiles, likely tear gas canisters, and 3 grass fires that were ignited by the police's weaponry. Protesters lit campfires to keep warm, the same fires police said presented a hazard. These are displayed as 3 cones in our model. As night fell, the air temperature also plummeted, hovering around -4 to -5 degrees Celsius. Of the 68 instances where the water hose was used, only 2 were specifically directed towards putting out campfires. All other instances clearly depict deliberate efforts to drench protesters with water that immediately turned icy cold in such frigid winter conditions.
Colette, I see I'm at time. I was going to show a clip from the more historic piece. I don't know if I can take another minute.
Sure, yeah, go ahead, Susan. Yeah, 1 more clip sounds great, and then we can have some questions.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and I'm happy to connect the dots between how the cold cases connect to the more to the other sort of more environmental projects, of course. The final clip is from a piece that is called Freezing Deaths, and there are no visual materials because there is no image archive. These are events that were clandestine, that were part of history of racist policing in Canada. There's no documentation. But there was the discovery of bodies of Indigenous people that were found frozen in the middle of winter, and this practice sort of starts in the 70s in sort of Western Canada in particular, but happened across the country and was still happening in 2015. And this practice was referred to as taking someone on a starlight tour. So unlike icebox detention, where the temperature is regulated and controlled by law, but the guards are still modulating the temperature, or at Standing Rock, where the nighttime water temperature was very, very cold. So the use of these crowd control kind of like tactics ended up producing really kind of really harmful experiences and conditions for protesters, and it was done very deliberately. But the practice wasn't quote unquote lethal, where in Canada it did the abandonment of people in sub-zero temperatures to walk back into town, having been dropped off on the outskirts, was a lethal practice. And it was it's a really kind of horrific kind of set of stories that I'm trying to tell about this pattern of abuse. So I'll play you a little bit from one of the clips, or one of the cases rather. In June 2003, Russell Sabo, chief of the Saskatoon Police Service, admits that an officer was disciplined in 1976 for abandoning a woman who was 8 months pregnant on the outskirts of the city. During the night, 3 people, all First Nations, were taken into custody by Constable Ken King and driven to an isolated area. There they were dropped off and forced to walk back in cold nighttime temperatures. King reportedly drove them outside the city limits as punishment for having liquor in a place other than a dwelling, rather than late charges. Paperwork would have necessitated bringing the 3 people into police facilities, where they would have spent the remainder of the night. King was eventually charged with discreditable conduct and neglect of duty, charges he repudiated. On October 15th, Constable Ken King was fined $200. This clandestine practice is known as taking someone on a starlight tour, a shadow system of racist policing in Canada aimed at evading the justice system, one that would repeat itself over decades to come. Okay, I'm going to stop it there. And
thank you, Susan. Thank you so much for that amazing presentation and for sharing with us your work as well. It was brilliant to see all of those clips of recent and, like you say, more historic work. We've opened for questions now, so if anyone wants to pop any questions into the chat or would like anything elaborating, please drop that in there and I'll read that out so everyone in the group can hear. But I see that we've got a question. Oh yeah, or obviously please do feel free to raise your hand and vocalize your question, as Nastasia is about to. Nastasia, would you like to unmute yourself?
Hello, thanks so much for that presentation, and it was really great to see also such recent footage from work that you've been doing, and yeah, hearing about how you've been working with people on that. One of the things that I suppose is really striking about the way that you work is that both as an individual artist and researcher, but also with forensic architecture, I suppose, is this kind of range of sort of aesthetic, I suppose, responding to these different aesthetic regimes and then working in a really broad way to then kind of make images or work with acoustic material and kind of represent that. And I suppose, yeah, one of the things I was really interested in as well was when you showed the work that you doesn't have the voiceover, and it made me think of kind of other work, like nature represents itself, and thinking about sort of how images are made in that way. So I suppose one of my questions is I suppose is that shift between sort of documentary and a work that kind of sits much more within documentary, and then a work that perhaps doesn't have kind of a voiceover and maybe I suppose allows the the kind of matter or the material to kind of tell that story, or kind of all of it's very kind of evidential, and is kind of, there's that thing of sort of storytelling and kind of providing evidence. And I suppose what I was going to ask is about sort of how you feel about when the difference between, I suppose, making an artwork and making something for that perhaps has sort of a more direct or clear narrative, I suppose, in the way that kind of a documentary might. And I wondered what you thought about that kind of balance that you try and kind of achieve, and whether there's something also about kind of the poetic and this attempt to sort of make something that is art-like, but that also kind of tells this story, but it seemed that there was an active attempt where you were trying to not get away from the voice, I suppose kind of trying to allow the sort of acoustic or the image to do that work for itself, and I was quite interested in that, and kind of what you thought about that process.
No, it's a fantastic question and set of observations, and really speaks directly to the kinds of challenges I've tried to both face, but also try and bring to the projects, and then my responses. So I do think in some way the cold cases, which I'm literally re-editing them now and tweaking them, is in part is perhaps a response to the environmental work whose politics sometimes might seem more ambient, or the ways that I'm working with the materials. There's we recognize these environments. There's certain kind of documentary tropes that one uses in these, that might be familiar inheritances to us from the histories of nature documentaries, etc. Because it was a bit weird for me to see, for example, those kind of walruses splashing around, even though I kept them in. It's the only animals that show up besides birds, and it's this sort of moment, and there's this sort of writhing in the water and everything. But anyway, long story short, so I think in some way the cold cases I know I want to deal very head on with the ways in which temperature, which is and in specific the cold temperatures, has been used against racialized bodies and be very explicit about that, and not mediate that through language of poetics, etc. At the same time, I didn't want to, with the Canadian case, that was the most challenging in terms of what kind of visual language could be generated when there is there's by and large an absence of the visual, but there are some autopsy images, etc. And I certainly would never and ever show any of that material. So the decision was to actually really focus on the pattern of abuse over decades, and to really demonstrate over and over again this pattern, and focus on the ways in which the journey from the time of pickup by police to abandonment. We also see the drop in temperature. So the mapping of the route is as precise as I could make it based on the testimonies, and then it's synced with Environmental Canada's hourly weather data at the time. So it's a very accurate image of the weather, if you will. So those cold cases where they're in some way a direct response to the fact that the politics that's operating is maybe a little bit more submerged in some of those other projects. But then at the same time, as part of your question asks, so for example, the work with Farooq and Faiza, etc., like Farooq will use that material in the ways that he needs to, like pedagogically, he wants to use the material we shot for training his students, etc., for public advocacy. He speaks a lot in different sort of scientific forums. And I'm also going to present something in this forum around the IPCC as a because of our collaboration together. So I really see the work as needing to move into many different sort of contexts. And so some of my work is to develop these projects and share them, and then they actually go into other sort of, they fall into the hands of others, and they move in particular. I know the scientists who I've worked with over the years have used them and shown them in very particular ways to their communities. And I think for the scientific practitioners, public outreach is key to their work, and their work doesn't make any sense unless it's attached to the social context in which all of the socio-cultural context in which decisions are being made, etc., etc. So Farooq understands really well the value of doing the work, of telling very particular stories, and sort of communicating why they're working on this glacier, what they're doing there, and what its particular relevance is. And he understands the need to develop strategies of narration. So I really see my role in that regard as sort of as a public kind of narrator, trying to move between different worlds, legal worlds, the techno-scientific, the kind of like they're activists, the kind of community, local communities, and sort of develop materials that can mediate these different kinds of communities and sort of relationships, and develop strategies for doing that. And maybe the final comment would be that I do give as an artist, because I will give myself permission to tell a story in a particular way, and I don't have the same sort of, in some way, burden that the agency forensic architecture has to like be always stay in that evidential space. So I introduce sound into like images and into my pieces that wasn't there, but it's manufactured, or I do use strategies of montage, etc. So the forensic in the cold cases, there's the visualizations that are developed, but then there's also a kind of creative license that I give myself, that I feel I need to bring something to those pieces that forensic architecture in their investigations would categorically refuse, because that would somehow trouble the evidential nature of some of these materials. So I hope that goes a little bit of a way to answering that very complex question.
Yeah, sorry, I think there are probably like 3 questions rolled into sort of that. But yeah, that's really helpful, thank you. And it also kind of answers some of the things I was thinking about in terms of kind of co-production and what happens to that material after, and those kind of relationships. So that's brilliant, thank you.
Thanks, Nastasia. Thanks, Susan. We just about drawing to a close, but we've got a few questions and comments in the chat that I'd like to share. They all relate, so if you're happy, Susan, I'll kind of read them out. So like I said, a few points and a question or two. So from Rebecca here, it's interesting to see the way that the different works are different ways of bearing witness to the very current and violent applications of cold, but also the ice cores bearing witness to the very long histories of climate change. In another breath, Miffy has said, how do they capture the air from the ice cores? And Rebecca has elaborated, saying, also interested in extremophiles, if there's any time to tell us about them, what we might learn from them.
Oh, great. Okay, I love those kinds of questions. So maybe the second one about like how the scientists take out the air. So I mean, so as I said, the air is trapped through the successive layers of snowfall. The snow, the pressure of the sort of those layers over many, many years will eventually trap the air. And then there's basically three methods that are used. There's people who do gas analysis. They can melt the ice. I mean, it's all done under vacuum, so you wouldn't be melting an ice core and then having the air from the room sort of mix with it. So it all has to be done under sealed conditions. So you can melt the ice, and then you have access to the air. Depending on the kinds of air, the kinds of gases, you have to use different techniques. So some gases are very soluble in water, so you couldn't melt them. Then you have to crush the ice to get the air out. So there's different techniques. The thing that I found fascinating in the lab was the ice. It's not ice for very long. Like they take it out of the freezer, immediately it goes into an instrument and it disappears. So in the archive, you have all those amazing cylindrical tubes, and it's a beautiful kind of space to see these ice cores and to open them up and to see, pull an ice core out. When you're in the laboratory, the ice sample it's cut, and they'll take a core and cut a little piece off, put it in a container, take it into the lab, and immediately goes into a machine and is crushed or melted. And in some cases, I've been told they have to send the water back because it might be a really important ice core. So a lot of people, for example, are keen on studying the bits of the ice core that relate to the Industrial Revolution. So that's a very sought after time period. And so, for example, if you're doing a specific kind of analysis and you melt the ice, you might send the water back to the ice core archive, and they send that water to a different lab that's interested in doing the water sample. The extremophiles, to answer that quickly, extremophiles are these microorganisms that can survive in very extreme conditions. And they can be, for example, anthrax spores. So in Russia, there was the situation with the thawing of the permafrost that anthrax spores were released back into the atmosphere. And they were initially really puzzled, like, why would there be this anthrax outbreak in this very remote part of northern Russia? Well, it turned out that the microorganisms that had been frozen for hundreds of thousands of years were being released back into the atmosphere through processes of thawing. So the release of these extremophiles is really significant because it's the release potentially of life forms that have never existed, certainly not within our sort of the period of, say, human habitation on the planet. It's also the risk that you introduce if you drill into the deep recesses of a glacial lake, a subglacial lake, or you drill into an ice core, are the microorganisms that actually are trapped in that ice, those extremophiles. What happens when those things reemerge into our kind of contemporary biosphere? And Rebecca's question, the first one, yes, it's exactly I wrote an entire book called Material Witness, and ultimately at the end of the day, I think all my work is still working through that very fundamental project of trying to understand how materials, whether those are environmental materials, so-called natural media, or like technical media, like images, videos, photographs, etc., can offer some sort of can bear witness to events, and what are the means by which we might have access to the data stored in materials. And that's been my sort of so-called life project as an artist and sort of researcher. So learning from ice is captures a lot of different work, but I think over and above that is this larger project called Material Witness that has been my sort of preoccupation for like a couple decades, in fact, and probably will continue to be the kind of case to really understand how materials register information about events, and also following those materials and trying to understand how those materials produce different regimes of witnessing, some of which are ignored completely and others which are taken much more seriously. So following those materials as they enter into different institutional frameworks can tell us a lot about the imagination operating there and the power relationships that might be operating in a court of law or in a scientific forum or within a kind of community context.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Susan. I've noted that we've gone over just by 5 minutes. So unless anyone's got any other burning questions or final comments, we'll begin to draw this evening to a close. So just to thank Susan again for her time and contribution this evening, again for compiling such an incredible array of very recent work, some of which might not have been seen before or widely seen, perhaps, Susan. So yes, we're very honoured to have seen that. And thank you everyone who joined us this evening, and thank you for your thoughts and comments. So just to reiterate the fact that this session has been recorded, so anyone who might have missed sections or had to dip out, you will be able to rewatch it via the New Midland Group website. I'll hopefully get that up by next week. And we'll have some upcoming programme taking place over the coming months through till April, May next year. So if you keep an eye on the website and sign up to our mailing list, you'll get information updates. And finally, to add that anyone who is a New Midland Group associate is welcome to stay on at the end of the conversation if they wish to check in with each other or continue the conversation. That's absolutely fine. Got a couple of thank yous. Thank you. Thanks connecting the personal to political so directly. Brilliant talk. Great to see the recent work. Thanks so much, Susan. Any final thoughts, Susan, before we say good evening?
It's no, just to say it's been a really nice opportunity to sort of present and talk through work that I'm literally working on now, and in some way. Everything is an experiment, and I really value those occasions when there can be some sort of feedback, response, etc. I mean, maybe I didn't allow enough time for discussion, but they're really important to me, these sort of moments of public kind of reflection, and also help me understand as I'm trying to narrate the sort of body of work to understand how it's all connected. It forces me into that sort of condition, so I really appreciate it, and thanks for everybody's patience and interest.
Thank you, Susan. Okay, so just again, I'm going to end the recording now. If any New Midland Group associates want to stick around, please do, but don't feel that you have to. Thank you again. Bye everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.